Hello everyone, today we are talking about prisoners on death row in the state of Alabama. This is part 3 of the series. Timothy Wade Saunders, 18 years on death row. On July 9th, Saunders bought crack cocaine twice. The first time he spent $50 on the drug and smoked it, and the second time he spent $100. Saunders claimed he went into the property next to his mother's mobile home. He told Mr. Clemens that he was getting high when he noticed him and asked him what he was doing there. Mr. Clemens then yelled at him and told him to leave the property. Saunders overheard him mention calling the police. This made him angry. He grabbed the crowbar and repeatedly struck Mr. Clemens in the head. He had borrowed that same crowbar from Mr. Clemens earlier that day. He then made the decision to go up to the Clemenses' home in an effort to steal any valuables so he could purchase more crack cocaine. He acknowledged that he pretended to have an asthma attack so that Mrs. Clemens would let him into the house. Saunders claimed that when Mrs. Clemens attempted to call for help, he became enraged and grabbed her from behind. Mrs. Clemens was taken to a rear bedroom by Saunders, who claimed he didn't mean to hurt her, and did it so he could close the door and flee. He then walked to his mother's trailer. Mr. Clemens was 77 years old. Saunders is now 44 years old. Jeremy Bryan Jones, 18 years on death row. He was found guilty of capital murder in the 2004 rape and gunshot death of Lisa Maureen Nichols, 44 years old. In Georgia, Jones is accused of killing Amanda Greenwell, 16 years old, in Douglasville. He is allegedly a suspect in the disappearance of Patrice Anders, a hairdresser from Forsyth County. According to investigators, he may be involved in another 10 murders. Jones assured the judge that God would have the last say before the punishment was read. Jones had severe mental and emotional difficulties, according to his defense counsel, including a long-term drug addiction that ought to be considered a mitigating circumstance. He is now 50 years old. Kenneth Eugene Billups, 17 years on death row. 24 years old Stephen Lockett was fatally shot by Kenneth Billups, and 3 days later, Billups also killed Rafael Salcedo, 15 years old, Enrique Marquez, 16 years old, Wilbur Gomez, 20 years old, and Manuel Perez Nunez, 27 years old. He pretended to be a drug dealer in order to get the 4 victims to a Center Point condominium on December 16, 2003. When they arrived, he killed all 4. Billups is now 50 years old. Christopher Anthony Floyd, 17 years on death row. He was convicted of murdering Archie Wayland Crawford, a grocery store owner, during a robbery in 1992. Patrick Emonson, the defense counsel, made an effort to cast doubt on whether the murder took place during a robbery, which would have made it a case for the death sentence. However, District Attorney Doug Valeska cited a recorded confession in which Floyd admitted to robbing Crawford. Floyd is now 51 years old. William Bruce Marshall, 17 years on death row. The Vestavia Hills Police Department received a call from Tonya Bentley on December 28, 2004, informing them that her daughter Alicia was missing from their residence. Marshall and Tonya Bentley had split up in the beginning of December 2004. From the apartment they had occupied with Marshall, Tonya, Alicia, and Tonya's infant boy had relocated to an apartment in a separate building. On the evening of December 29th, the day after Alicia went missing and while being questioned by the FBI, Marshall acknowledged that he had done a terrible thing. According to Marshall, Alicia and him got into a verbal altercation that had turned violent, and he had punched her in the head with his hand. He explained that he had brought her out in the country and left her there, but he was unsure if she was okay. Marshall traveled outside of Columbiana in a vehicle with law enforcement officers. He was finally able to direct authorities to Alicia's body after scouring off many side roads. Except for a pair of white socks, she was naked. The body's examination confirmed that Alicia had been killed by strangulation. Marshall is now 59 years old. Thomas Robert Lane, 17 years on death row. He got the death penalty for murdering his wife. Teresa, a Filipina immigrant who resided with a friend in Irvington while she lived apart from her husband Lane, was discovered dead in the bathtub. Teresa Lane sustained injuries resembling those caused by blunt force trauma. Although there were no indications of forced entry inside the house, a forensic expert was able to match a chisel mark within the front door frame to a tool discovered inside Thomas Lane's truck in the days following the murder. Ashley Rich, the district attorney for Mobile County, led the prosecution in constructing a case based on Lane's need for money and concern over moving on with a new wife. Rich presented documents indicating Lane's financial devastation as he prepared for divorce because Lane was financially dependent on his wife. According to neighbors and other people who came into contact with Lane, he was quite open about his hatred for his wife and his intentions for the future once he was divorced. According to a nearby Nissan salesman, Lane once said, "The only decent woman is a dead one." A co-worker of Lane's wife testified that Lane instructed her to tell his wife that she would be regretful if she decided not to come back. He is now 58 years old. Craig Newton, 17 years on death row. The victim, Charles Clarence Watley and Chandra Alexander, met up and started consuming crack cocaine at Alexander's house on the evening of April 30, 2001. They ran out of drugs early on May 1, 2001, so they decided looking for more. They visited a house in Tuskegee, Alabama, in search of drugs, where they ran across Craig Newton. He claimed that he could help them to buy more narcotics. Watley, Alexander, and Newton made a stop at the Watley's home on their route to get the drugs. When Newton arrived at Watley's house, he wanted to know where the cash and the weapons were located. Additionally, Newton gave Alexander instructions to use an electrical line to bind the victim. Newton attempted to suffocate Watley by placing a sack over his head while he struggled to free himself from the cord. Newton continued to demand information regarding the location of the victim's weapons and money while he started to free himself from the plastic bag. Newton then doused the victim in gasoline or lighter fluid and lit him on fire. According to the co-defendant's testimony, the victim had put out the fire on himself when Newton approached him, pointed the pistol at the side of the victim's head, and shot him. Newton is now 47 years old. Michael Lynn Sale, 17 years on death row. He was accused of physically and emotionally terrorizing his wife until she died in a hospital. Lynn Sale, his wife, succumbed to her injuries, including gangrene, bruising, and bite marks, 15 days after he called 911 and had her admitted to a hospital in Dothan. Michael Crespi, the defense attorney, requested the jury to advise life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, he told the jury that Michael Sale provided his wife with food, water, and medication before eventually dialing 911. Sale is now 68 years old. Jason Michael Sharp, 17 years on death row. According to court records, Jason Sharp essayed and killed Tracy Morris, a nurse. The trial took 7 years to start, and the judge and jury decided the offense was severe enough to warrant the death penalty. Sharp is now 46 years old. Ellis Louis Mashburn, 17 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Clara Ava Birmingham, 80 years old, and her husband Henry Birmingham, 85 years old. The murders started as a robbery, and the victims were in fact his grandparents. The couple died from stab wounds and blunt force trauma. Both have been severely beaten and stabbed. They were discovered on October 30th, and the murders occurred on the evening of October 29. Both Clara Birmingham and her husband tried to defend themselves and were aware of their impending deaths. Mashburn is now 45 years old. Corey Shirod Smith, 28 years on death row. The burnt remains of Kimberly Brooks were found rolled in a carpet on February 24, 1995, by a gravel road in Bibbtown, according to Tallapoosa police. The coroner testified that Brooks died from shots to the head and the chest and suspected asphyxiation. I'm going to read you the written confession of Corey Smith about what happened to Kimberly. Kim came to the house around 7:30 a.m. Wednesday morning with Labrisha Main. We was talking about getting married later on. My brother Reginald came and Main left. After a while, Reginald left. When my mama got off work, me and Kim got into an argument about another girl calling me. We went outside. I pulled my gun on her. Sanjay Brooks and Shantai Smith pulled up. I forced her into the van. I told Sanjay to go to Bibbtown, which he did. and when we got there, Kim and I got out, continuing arguing. I told her I love her, and if I couldn't have her, no one could. She told me she loved me, but things weren't the same. I kissed her on the forehead and pushed her off me and shot her in the chest. And then she fell to the ground, and I shot her again towards her head. Shantai got out and helped me drag her into the bushes. We left. Sanjay dropped us off into the soft sands. When he returned, we got James Shealy's car and got some gas and went back where I left her. When we got there, she was standing up, and she got into the car and sat beside me. I was scared. Sanjay rode from Biptown to Realtown looking for a place to set her on fire and bury her. I asked her what she would say if I took her to the hospital. She say, "I'm going to say Corey shot me." We returned back to Biptown and Sanjay dropped us off. He told us to go ahead and finish her and he'll be back. We put a trash bag over her face until she died. I poured the gas on her and Shantai lit the lighter. Sanjay never returned. We left there and walked back to my house. Shantai spent the night. The next day he left and I never saw him again. Corey Smith's co-defendants, Sanjay Brooks and Shantai Smith, Smith's cousins, got life in prison after agreeing to testify against Corey. He is now 47 years old. Bobby Jr. Baker, 28 years on death row. On April 10, 1994, Baker kidnapped his estranged wife Tracy from her house, coerced her into his car, and then fatally shot her 5 times. Prior to his retrial, Baker gained notoriety when authorities discovered the hit list in his cell shortly after his 1995 conviction. Houston County Circuit Judge Lawson Little was one of the people on the list, and despite the ostensible threat to his life, he refused to step aside from presiding over the trial. Baker is now 50 years old. Ulysses Charles Snead, 28 years on death row. Clarence Eugene Terry, 51 years old, the clerk of a convenience shop, was shot and killed during a heist by Charles Snead and John Hardy. He was shot 5 times in the head and once in the chest. Hardy being the one who pulled the trigger, while Snead was stealing the money in the cash register. Snead and Hardy were detained in Louisville, where Hardy was visiting family. They were found guilty and given death sentences. In 2016, John Hardy passed away in prison. Snead is now 54 years old. Albert Mack, 27 years on death row. Patrick Corey Holman's body was discovered in the trunk of a 1974 Oldsmobile Cutlass on the evening of July 12, 1993. In the vicinity of the entrance to the Royal Pines development, a suburban area close to Tuscaloosa, the Cutlass was parked on the side of Saunders Ferry Road. He had been shot in the back of the head, instantly murdered, his body put in the trunk, and the car had been set on fire. The prosecution argued that the crime happened during a robbery, reason for which Mack received the death penalty. The defense team, however, claimed that Mack shot Holman because he believed he was planning to kill Mack and his friend Roy Craig. Craig had sold Holman $500 worth of poor dope. Mack is now 56 years old. Kerry Dale Grayson, 27 years on death row. Vicky DeBlio, age 37, was dropped off by a friend on I-59 close to Chattanooga, Tennessee on the evening of February 21, 1994, so she could hitchhike to her mother's house in Louisiana. She was spotted traveling by 4 teens who had been consuming alcohol and using drugs. Kerry Grayson, Kenny Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Luis Mangione. Instead of taking her to Louisiana as they had promised, they drove her to a secluded area while pretending to pick up another vehicle. When they got out of the car and arrived in this place, they all started drinking. Miss DeBlio started to flee from the boys who were throwing bottles at her. They kicked her repeatedly all over her body after tackling her to the ground. When they saw she was still alive, one of them, supported by Grayson, stood on her throat till she gurgled blood and murmured, "Okay, I'll party," before passing away. After removing her clothing and ring, they placed her body in the back of a pickup truck, drove her and her luggage to Bald Rock Mountain, where they played with her body before tossing it off a cliff. They next headed to a Pell City car wash to wash the blood from the truck. They searched through her bags and concealed it in the forest. They brought Mangione home after leaving Birmingham and went back to Bald Rock Mountain to begin mutilating the body. They stabbed and sliced her 180 times, removed part of a lung, and severed her fingers and thumbs. 3 rock climbers discovered Mrs. Debliau's body on February 26, 1994, and reported it to the authorities. The office of the medical examiner received her body. Her left lung had been removed, all of her fingers and both thumbs had been severed, and the medical examiner discovered 180 stab wounds post-mortem done, 2 large incisions in her chest, almost every bone in her skull fractured, every bone in her face fractured at least once, lacerations over these fractures, and the missing tooth. The medical examiner concluded that she was still alive during the beating and that blunt force injuries to the head were the cause of death. After Mangione started showing one of Mrs. Debliau's fingers to his friends, all accused were subsequently detained. Grayson is now 49 years old. James William McGowan, 27 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of an elderly couple. Deidre Ann Crane was also part of the crime. In 1997, Cray testified before a jury that McGowan took her up from her parents' house at midday, and the two of them used nearly all of the $150 worth of crack he had with him. They were running low on supplies, so he bought $50 more. She claimed that she eventually sold her ring for $20, using the proceeds to purchase more crack. Later, the pair went to the Harper's house, where James McGowan made up a tale to get Harper to give them $125 so they could buy more cocaine. They went back to Harper's house when James Robert Pitts declined to give them any money. Crane testified that while traveling there, they acquired the murderous weapon. When they got there, Crane kept Harper occupied while McGowan fatally struck him with a hammer from behind at least 4 times. The duo used the $165 they discovered in their victim's wallet to purchase more crack. The two then drove to Evergreen, stopping along the route at the Johnson's residence in the Antioch neighborhood, according to the trial testimony. McGowan struck Johnson, 82 years old, 3 times on top of the head with the hammer as soon as he turned his back on him. Crane claimed that as she went outside, she could see McGowan's shadow as he raised the hammer and repeatedly struck Johnson's widow, 79 years old, through the bedroom window. During the penalty phase, a jury recommended that McGowan be given a life sentence without the possibility of release. McGowan was found guilty of 2 charges of capital murder, and the trial judge overturned the jury's verdict, ordering that he be executed for the heinous acts. Crane got life in prison. McGowan is now 70 years old. That was all for part 3. We will continue with part 4 on Friday. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.